That data has now caused them to have some insights and really start to begin to think about ways to update maybe some key reports or other systems or platforms that need updating around that set of data. Now, when you think about updating data, usually there's a trigger, maybe you need some approval process, and you just need to let other folks know what's going on about the subset of data or why the data is changing. So then maybe we need to create a to-do, right? Give people some action items for them to review and take action on maybe that data or those key reports that have been updated based on the analysis of the information. So when we create the to-do, wouldn't it be great if we can create a notification, either push, email, right? Some sort of notification, maybe a channel message or a chat conversation inside of Teams as a way to create that proactive notification and get people engaged into what's going on in the environment. Now, of course, when you're looking at data and you're analyzing it, it's really great to bring on collaboration and get people to really look at it, have those conversations, and really begin to sort of analyze and get multiple viewpoints on that data to make sure that that decision or the actions that's being taken with that data subset has, validity and is valid. And so, would you like to schedule a discussion? Let's bring these people together. Let's talk about the analysis and the data that we've got, and let's figure out our next steps. So now as we do that, maybe we have a meeting, conversation, maybe it's a screen share and we're able to do real-time document collaboration through the Teams environment as an example. And at some point, we need to approve that update. Now, once we've approved the update, of course, we do need to archive the old data and the old documents and sort of work through those processes. Now, when you think of that business process, let's overlay the various tools and technologies that are behind the scenes. So obviously we've got Excel potentially, we've got Word, SharePoint, maybe we're using the to-do platform, we've got notifications coming in from Outlook as an example, maybe we're scheduling with the Outlook calendar. Now we're taking advantage of the approval process flow in SharePoint and Power Automate, and then of course archiving that document inside of SharePoint. Now all of that can be hosted inside of Microsoft Teams. Really think about using Microsoft Teams as potentially that single pane of glass that allows your users to come into one location to really take a look at the data, work with it, provide notifications, create opportunities for collaboration and engagement, and then even bolting on and leveraging all of the other rich capabilities of the M365 platform. We've got the opportunity to create that discussion, the notifications, the to-dos. Maybe it requires a much larger team. Maybe this belongs in Microsoft Planner, where folks can come together and collaborate with a planner board, right? So how do we take all of these different rich tools and expose them in that one single interface? And that's really where Microsoft Teams is going to come into play. Now, with that, we need to think about how we're going to access that data. So in some situations, we've already got connectors and tools already bolted into the Teams experience that allows you to just simply turn those features on right within inside the platform. There are, of course, other scenarios where you really do need to leverage the Graph API and take advantage of getting data in and out through code. And so we're going to walk through those different scenarios in a moment. Now, when you're thinking about developing an application, one of the things you do want to think about is what platforms do you need to write your application for? What platforms do you need to support? Do you need your application to be exposed maybe in the Outlook experience? Could it be within Teams? Should it be in SharePoint? Should it be a Windows application, right? When you think about those components, you also need to think about the device size and the type. So there's a lot of opportunity when you think about it to have to manage and potentially build applications that are going to conform to a variety of device sizes, as well as different device types. Now, the one thing that I like about the Microsoft Teams platform is that it's going to take care of a lot of that for me. So if I use Microsoft Teams as my canvas to present my applications, I write my application for Teams, and Teams will take care of managing it, whether it's on a mobile device, a browser, we're dealing with it inside of the Teams client on a desktop, as well as those components can be reused and exposed through Outlook, SharePoint, or even a Windows-based app. So there's a lot of advantages of, when you start to design and build your applications, focusing in on the Microsoft Teams platform and methodologies. And once you do, you'll be able to really manage and develop those applications very, very quickly and support them over the long term. Now, there's three core components to think about when we're writing code. One of them is, could we write code quickly with very little effort or even have to be a programmer in that sense? And so you've got the opportunity to write code in what we classify as the low code scenario. And here you've got the ability to write applications and expose them into teams in Excel, and through SharePoint, as well as the Power Automate platform, without actually writing a single line of code. Now, you'll leverage the tools and the frameworks that are available to, in essence, pull things together and sort of put together flows, for example, in Power Automate, but you're not actually writing code. So we classify that as your low code solution. Then you get into this other side of the house where with SharePoint and Power Automate, you can even extend those further and actually write some code incorporated into them. Then you have the ability to write custom code for Office add-ins, as well as things like actionable messages. Right? Here's this opportunity now to take code that you may have written in other languages and of course expose those conversations and collaborations and application data and information inside of that team's experience. And so we'll dive a little bit more into that in a little bit. Now, before we get deep into the mechanics of how to build low code and 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 code-based applications, I do want to sort of dive into again some of the foundational pieces. You're going to need identity, access controls, authorization as part of your application experience for security, for privacy, right? And of course, the best practices around security compliance and governance. So what I want to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the Microsoft Identity Framework and how we're going to manage identities through the registration of an application, how you're going to implement authentication, and how you're going to implement the authorization side of it. And so let's dive into those components now. So what is the Microsoft Identity? Well, the Microsoft Identity is a platform that allows developers, right, to build applications that allow you to sign in using Microsoft identities. This is where you're going to get a token, and then using that token is where you're going to gain access to APIs such as the Graph API and other information and resources that are available across the Microsoft 365 stack or other resources you may have configured and leveraging Azure AD. Now, there's a couple different types of users inside of the Microsoft identity. So there is Azure AD itself. This is going to allow you to allow your employees, your enterprise resources, access to information and knowledge that's sitting inside of your Azure AD tenant. Azure B2B is going to allow you to collaborate and share information and authenticate with individuals across tenants. So inside of my organization, we're able to share and collaborate with individuals, maybe inside of your organization or applications. You also have the ability to leverage Azure B2C. This is where you will basically build out an environment that allows you to have customers sign in. So could be individuals at other organizations, maybe who are not leveraging Azure AD, and have that opportunity to bring them into that experience. Now, as part of that, we're going to define things like resources. What exactly are we giving access to? As well as policies. Once we've given them access, what can they do with the data and the information? Is it read only, read write, right? And different scenarios like that. So we're going to dive a little deeper here. So let's talk a little bit about the Microsoft Identity Platform v2, which is an evolution of the Azure Active Directory v1 endpoint. So from a developer perspective, obviously we've enhanced that authorization capability, and we'll dive into that. So the Microsoft Identity Platform itself consists of OAuth 2.0 and the OpenID Connect standard for the compliant authentication capabilities, a bunch of open source libraries. There's an application management portal, the application configuration API in PowerShell, and then obviously the developer content itself. So let's take a look at this diagram and just break down and talk a little bit about the overview and sort of what the Microsoft Identity Platform is. So obviously you've got your applications that have been registered. Let's use portal.azure.com as an example. And you'll see we've got the ability to go into portal.azure.com, enter our username and password, and then begin to process. Now, in the old Azure AD for Developers V1 endpoint, you see we're going to leverage the Client SDK Azure AD Authentication Library, or ADAL. That's going to then talk to an endpoint called Azure AD Endpoint V1. And in this case, you'll see that we're going to connect into work or school accounts. This is the Azure AD identity that allows you to get access into resources that are in the tenant. So one of the primary things you'll notice that's different here is that when you're dealing with the Microsoft Identity Platform, we've got the Microsoft Authentication Library, which is then going to talk to the Microsoft Identity Platform Endpoint v2, which has access to not just the tenant work or school accounts inside of Azure AD, but also personal accounts with Microsoft accounts. Those are the live IDs and those similar accounts, as well as social or local accounts. This is that Azure AD B2C. This is going to allow maybe a user to come in from their Facebook account, Google, GitHub account, LinkedIn, etc. Again, as you're thinking about the Microsoft Identity Platform, it does give us the ability to support consumer accounts, enterprise accounts, the ability to create business-to-business integrations, basically tenant-to-tenant integration, and of course that business-to-consumer scenarios. And so that's all part of that identity platform and the enhancements that we've done in the new V2 endpoint. All right, so let's go to where it all begins when you start working with applications in Microsoft Teams. So one of the first things you need to do is, as you start to build your application, is to register it and allow it to begin to have authorization and access to resources and data that may exist across the Microsoft Graph or within Azure AD. So let's talk a little bit about the application model itself. So there is the first component, the core component, which is the authentication. Are my username and credentials valid? And am I allowed to authenticate into the system and get a request token? Once I've gotten and received my token, do I have authorization, or what authorization do I have across the platform? And so do I have permissions to read data, to write data? How does that look? So there's the authorization component. What am I authorized to do? Then you've really got that application object, which is going to give you that consent component, the ability to then proceed and work through those scenarios. You've got the service principal, which is really designed to tie the application again with that service principal, things like tenant to tenant conversations, right? Sort of managing that authorization endpoint. And then, of course, the consent, right? And managing that sort of return token through that workflow and cycle. So let's talk a little bit about the application and service principal objects. So you've got the application object, which is going to be the application properties that are stored inside of the manifest file. We'll talk a little bit about the manifest file in a moment. That's going to really help you to define the required application permissions. And then there's the service principal object. This is going to be a copy of the application's object used, right, in either your non-home tenants or within your tenant to define the application's permissions. And as you see here in the diagram, we've got this individual tenant and datum, and we've got this HR application. That's going to be your service principal, right, and the ability to sort of connect to the object, manage your keys, and allow those other organizations you'll see, Contoso and Fabricam, to again integrate and work through those service principles. Right? So just in essence, providing that the permission model and being able to manage the tokens through that sort of B2B conversation in this particular example. Now, as you're sort of determining the account types in those scenarios, again, single organization, multiple organization, this is going to be used with individuals coming in from personal accounts. And so as you begin to build and register your application, these are some things you need to think about as far as who is going to, or what organizations and individual types do you need to support to get in and leverage your application. Right? Again, it's within your own maybe tenant, where you're going to do a B2B scenario where you're going to support multiple tenants, and then, or you're going to support more of a B2C, which again are those Microsoft accounts. Now, as you walk through that registration of an application process, obviously you'll need things like the application name. Again, thinking about the supported application types. Is it within your tenant? Would this be a B2B scenario? So it's your tenant as well as external tenants, or are you going to also include customers in that? So you need to think of the B2C. Now, once you've defined the name, you've selected your account type, you do need to think about what is your endpoint that you're going to pass the user to once they've successfully authenticated. So that redirection URI is basically the landing page that the user will be presented with once they have completed the authorization in the authentication phase. Now, as you begin to dive and work a little bit further through the registration process, we'll get into a step where you're going to need to think about the app's roles. And here you're going to have the opportunity to focus in on the application roles and what is the assigned permissions that the users will have around that. So this is Azure AD app roles. We'll be dealing with things like Azure AD security groups, as well as the application manager role, and sort of defining those workloads and those roles so that you know how the application will work, what groups within the tenant, for example, will work, and then who's sort of the owner or the manager of the application as part of that sort of lifecycle management component. So here's an example of a visual for getting into the Azure AD app manifest itself. Now, the app manifest is nothing more than a JSON file. It's a JavaScript object notation file that has key value pairs that define the variety and various information that's part of the manifest itself. As you see here, we're in the Contoso app, and one of the options that we'll have under the management of that application is the manifest. And here you'll be able to see all of the details and configuration information, and obviously the ability to manually modify those settings as needed through that application file. All right, so let's do this. Let's take a moment. Let's go through a demo of an actual registration of an application in Azure Active Directory. All right, so let's open up Microsoft Edge. In Microsoft Edge, what we're going to do is we're going to go to portal.azure.com. The reason we're going to portal.azure.com is because we want to get into the Azure AD configuration section. We want to be able to go ahead and create for our demo application a dedicated tenant so we can have a separate set of users and settings for this particular application. So let's go to portal.azure.com. And once we're in the Azure portal, we're going to navigate to Azure Active Directory. And you'll see it here on the left-hand side. So now we're going to go inside of Azure Active Directory. Here you'll see all of the configuration settings and options for Azure Active Directory. In this case, you'll see I'm in this demo tenant environment called Contoso. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually go in now and create a new tenant. So I'll select create a new tenant. And here you see it gives me the opportunity to create a new directory that will be associated with this new tenant that we're going to create. Now, if I had an Azure B2C subscription added to this tenant, I would have the option here, as you can see, to select Azure B2C. This is going to come into play when you're, again, going to bring in folks that are coming in from consumer-based accounts such as Facebook, Google, etc. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to configuration. So let me select next, and let's move into configuration. All right, so now we're on the configuration page. I'm going to call this Contoso Marketing Company. For the domain, I'm going to go Contoso Marketing. Provide a number. And then we will select the country and move on to the next step and review. So you see here, I'm just creating the domain, my initial domain, which will be an on Microsoft domain. This case, mine will be Contoso Marketing 9999. I am choosing the United States for that region and location, and I'll click next to just do a quick final review. So as you see, again, we're creating a directory in Azure Active Directory. It will be a standard Azure Active Directory tenant. We're going to call it the Contoso Marketing Company with the location and the country and region in the United States. And so I will choose Create and spin that tenant up right now. So as you see up in the top right, the process is going. We're kicking off the creation of the tenant and the new domain. We come up here to the bell. We can see the current status. And as you can see, it is currently in the middle of creating the directory. It started a few minutes ago and will take a few moments. All right, our tenant has been created, and we're going to go ahead and select to join into that new tenant. All right, so now that we've created the tenant, let's create a user, which we'll use as part of the initial setup of our application. So let's go ahead and select users. And in users, we're going to select create new user. Create a new user. We'll call this user test user. And we'll create. All right, so now that we've created this test user, let's go and attempt to log in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a in private browser window. And we'll attempt to log into portal.azure.com. All right, so as you can see, we're logging in. So I'm going to go ahead and change the password based on our policies. And as you see, we've successfully logged in, so we can validate that our username and password, as well as our new Azure AD domain, is up and running and configured correctly. All right, so now that we've created our account and we've got a new domain, let's go in and set up a app registration. So let me flip over, and for my test user, let's go in and just switch directories. All right, so let's now actually move on to creating an app registration. So we're going to go in, let's get this window out of the way, just take a look and make sure we are in our correct Contuso directory. So let me switch back to my Contuso environment. All right, so now that we're inside of Contoso, let's go back and do app registrations. So you'll see here under Manage, App Registrations, we're going to select New Registration. All right, so we're going to call this application Contoso app. We're going to go ahead and leave this one as a single tenant-based app and just keep it focused on an application that'll work within the tenant. We're not going to support multi-tenant scenarios, that federated scenario, or we're not going to support personal accounts. And we'll go ahead and click Register. And now we've basically set up our initial app registration. So let's go through and talk a little bit about the branding and sort of the customization of the app registration itself. So on the left, you'll see we've got this option here for branding. And so when we click on branding, you'll see there's some options here. Here's an opportunity for us to upload a new custom logo specific to this particular application, the application's homepage URL, any terms of service, privacy statements, as well as the tenant environment that you're currently set up on. If you're also coming in as a Microsoft partner, here's an opportunity to apply your MPN, your partner ID. This helps for metrics and other components that are coming down in the back end to help you enable and see how well your application is being distributed across various customers that you may deploy it to. Now, as you see here within the app registration page, we do have additional settings, authentication, digital certificates and secrets we can apply, token configuration, obviously various API permissions. So here's where we can go in and define various rules and configurations that are associated to this app registration. In this case, right now, by default, I have user read, which allows me to sign in and read the user's profile as the person connects. And at this point, my application really doesn't have access to much. So this would be one of the next few phases we'd go through as we begin to write our app and work through sort of the continuing of connecting that app into the Graph API and the various resources in Office 365, as well as inside of Azure Active Directory. So this sort of covers the initial settings here for our prep work to get the app registration configured and turned on. So identity is a core element in most applications, allowing you to control access to systems and to data. By leveraging the Microsoft Identity Platform, you get to take advantage of all the rich features and security capabilities of Azure AD, with things such as multi-factor authentication. So we're going to take a 10-minute break. We'll see everybody back here shortly, and we'll get started with Module 2.